Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Reka Chirivolu, Nixon Peabody's Director of Diversity and Inclusion. Welcome to our panel discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion in Boston. We are thrilled to welcome our fantastic panelists who will be providing us with their perspectives on how we can promote greater equality within our organizations and in our communities, with a focus on Greater Boston. This year has been challenging on many levels. What started with the global pandemic that disproportionately affected Black and Brown communities was followed by the murder of George Floyd this summer, which led to mass protests across the country. These events sparked a movement for real change to address systemic racism and create greater equality and social justice in communities across the country and across the world. The work ahead is not easy or simple. It will require people across all races, age groups, and industries coming together to work towards a common goal. We hope you will come away from today's program with a deeper understanding of the challenges we are facing and some ideas for best practices you can utilize within your organizations and communities to foster greater equity and inclusion. I'd like to introduce our wonderful panelists today. First, we have Carolyn Crockett, the Chief of Equity for the City of Boston. Deborah Hughes, the President and CEO of Brookview House. Ingrid Jacobs, the Chief Diversity Officer of Eaton Vance. Danny Moore, the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Mass General Brigham. Our co-moderators are Kathleen Siglarski-Burns and Chris Froh, who are the co-managing partners of Nixon Peabody's Boston office. Kathleen is also a partner in our Complex Commercial Disputes Practice Group, and Chris is a partner in our Affordable Housing and Real Estate Group. Without further ado, I will turn this over to Kathleen and Chris. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Reka, and thank you to all of our incredibly distinguished panelists for joining us here today. We're so grateful for the opportunity to talk with you. And I want to welcome everybody who's joining us virtually. We did receive a number of questions that you submitted in advance, and we tried our best to incorporate those into the discussion today. And we'll also try to answer audience questions before we wrap up, so you can use the Q&A box for that, and we'll try to get to those at the end. Like Reka said, our goal for today is to have an open discussion on racial equity and the roles that each sector can play in dismantling systemic racism in Boston. Like so many of our colleagues, clients, and friends in the audience, all of us at NP are committed to transforming our organization to be even more inclusive and equitable. And we want everyone in the audience to walk away with some concrete ideas for how to achieve those goals, not just within our own organizations, but within the entire community. We also want to try to provide a call to action on the next steps in this movement. So I will now turn it over to Chris to get the discussion started.
Thanks, Kathleen. And as Kathleen mentioned, we're focused on the city of Boston, obviously with our panel and our office. But we think this discussion will have a broad appeal to the community communities across the country. So the first question right off the bat is we'd like to hear from how this summer's protests after George Floyd's murder affected your respective organizations. Starting with Carolyn, the Officer of Equity and your role as Chief of Equity was created a month after George Floyd's murder. Can you tell us how the Office of Equity came to be and what you're charged with doing?
Sure, Chris, thank you for the question. And I really thank Nixon Peabody and the entire team for convening us for such an important and timely conversation. Reka's leadership is appreciated and received, and I'm just so looking forward to this discussion. So we are finding ourselves in a tremendous moment of crisis, of more or less a triple pandemic, absolutely. And so in June of this year, Mayor Walsh called out racism as a public health crisis. And in so doing, really pointed out a true north for calling out not only the injustice and the history of racial oppression, and white supremacy in the country, in our history, and in our city, but the need to understand that racism is a toxin that is creating a crisis and an emergency that is political, that is economic, that is environmental, and then city government must take the lead in calling this out and understanding how we move towards structural change. And so following that act up by calling into being a Chief of Equity for the City of Boston, and appointing me in that role in June is another example of the mayor's commitment to addressing systemic racism, but also bringing an intersectional understanding of equity that would pull and center racial justice, economic inclusion, and health equity. So the work is really about systems change. We know enough to know that this is not about behaviors or decisions of individuals. It's about how we call out policies, how we call out plans, procedures, and investment flows. And so my work is to embed equity through all of the city's work. That includes and covers more than 50 departments and agencies, and a talent pool of 18,000 employees. But we can't do it alone, which makes work of our partners like Nixon Peabody and others across the city and the corporate sector, education sector, and health sector vital. So really, really delighted to be here and to roll up our sleeves with my sleeves with these very powerful women we have assembled here today.
And so I'll just go around, you have the Hollywood squares. And so just to go around, maybe to hit the same question, Deborah, you're next, if I'm working left to right, do you want to hit the question of just how your organization has responded and to the events of this summer, and similar question to Carolyn.
At Brookview, we primarily work with low-income communities, and the majority of them are women with children. So what we found is that after George Floyd's murder, the parents were terrified for their kids. And one of the questions the kids asked us is, if I walk outside, will I be murdered? So our response to that was, because we do provide a huge, kids are our largest population that we serve, when we do a full day summer program. So what we did is provide an opportunity for the children and youth to learn about Black Lives Matter. That was our theme for the summer. So part of learning about Black Lives Matter is also learning about, for us, helping the kids learn to find their voice. It's about learning how to express what they were feeling, learning how to use social media to express, to relate, to get out there and connect with others. Learning all the different platforms. They did spoken word, they did writing. We had teachers come in virtually, of course. We were in person, but the teachers were virtual. So because we never closed our doors. So also for our theme for this fall is to help the kids learn about podcasting. So that's another way for them to express what they're feeling and what they're experiencing, and to let the world know, and to learn how to advocate what it is that they need.
Ingrid?
Amazing.
Sure. At our firm, we had our senior leaders speak out pretty quickly and pretty decisively on how they felt about this tragedy, not just of George Floyd, but just a list that is appallingly long of other Black and brown people that have been murdered. So I just think it's important for us to kind of acknowledge that as a firm, and then also to think about what are we going to do about it. So we did move forward with things like having caring conversations within our firm where it was open. Obviously, we're in a virtual platform, but we had the design was to have it, no more than 30-ish people, because once you get beyond that, we're in the Hollywood Squares world where you're going to 3, 4, 5 pages. It just doesn't feel like you can really have a conversation. But what we did was leverage the technology that we had to really give people an opportunity to have a safe space to talk. This was open to anyone who signed up for each one of the sessions. We hosted several of them, 15 or 20 of them, and basically just said, please come. We set the stage as to what the conversation was going to be about. It was definitely going to be talking about race. We had high turnout and high appreciation for people just wanting to talk about something that, for most everyone's lives, they hadn't had kind of almost like the permissions, or they've been kind of taught not to talk about race, religion, all these different things in the office. And so it was a great platform for people to be able to do that. But what was really key was people trying to say, well, what should I do if I'm interested in wanting to make a difference? And we put a lot of onus on employees and to talk about this, to not just have it be a one and done engagement, to also do research, to go back to their desks and then not necessarily depend on people of color that they know either in the workplace or in their home life to educate them, but to take ownership in their own education on ways that potentially, racism or discrimination or things that have manifested in our society, just to explore and learn, so that way they could take away some real awareness and then figure out how to do something with it. So we have continued to have those same kinds of conversations. We're normalizing that within the firm, so it's not sadly directly correlated with just that type of a tragedy, but also just talking about conversations that go beyond your usual, did you get the report done? Did you turn this in? That kind of a thing. So.
Thanks, Ingrid. Excuse me. Danny,
Yeah.
last
So,
but not least, of course.
okay, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. And welcome everyone this afternoon. And it's a pleasure to be on this panel with my distinguished colleagues, some who I know and have been working with for a while. And I would say that Mass General Brigham, we were at the apex of COVID because we're the largest healthcare system in Massachusetts and the largest private employer with 78,000 employees. So we actually were involved in a conversation about race as a result of COVID before George Floyd's murder, and is that COVID highlighted the disparities in diverse communities around the nation, and began to raise the conversation about what do we do differently. And so when we had the racial crisis this summer, and the CDC, called it a public health crisis, and people were rightfully so reacting at an emotional height, we had to begin to ask ourselves, okay, so what's next and what do we do? Because many of our leaders were on front lines in terms of healthcare. Our doctors, our physicians working incredible hours. We were in diverse communities, mobilizing in a way that we hadn't before in terms of testing in diverse communities, providing gift bags, providing food, and also even for our own employees who were suffering as a result of one or their partner or someone in their family perhaps not being able to work and have a paycheck. And so there was a lot of conversation about what can we do in the urgency of now, right? Ignite it. And I had to do a lot of coaching about stepping back. And let's not get lost in the emotion of the moment and the intensity of the moment, and try and come up with some quick fix to this situation, because we could do something, but if it wasn't the right thing, it would be just as disastrous as doing nothing. And so our organization stepped back and decided what we were going to do. And what we came up with is a strategy we call United Against Racism. It is a comprehensive strategy that involves workforce equity, health equity, and community equity. And so Dr. Tom Sequist leads the health equity and community equity, and I lead the workforce equity. And we looked at that. It is well resourced. Also, I would say that our organization absolutely stepped up in that way to resource the strategy. And some of the things that's in it is we are setting hiring and promotion goals for the very first time in the history of this organization, that we actually are having an incident reporting platform installed so people can identify when they are having an experience or observe an experience that has racial connotations to it. That we have expanded our interpreter services and translation services, because our patients speak 42 different languages. And in order to communicate with them, we need to have more people who speak a variety of languages. We also are looking at improving access to technology through digital health and providing iPads so that some of our patients who do not have the capability of purchasing an iPad, there's something there for them to use so that they can still continue to seek healthcare. And so this comprehensive strategy, we're in startup stage, but I would also say we've been doing this work for a very long time. We have set the foundation for the work. That the DE&I work has been amazing in our organization. We had Robin DiAngelo back in February who come in to talk about white privilege. And so these conversations, we talked about the the Florida nightclub shootings. We talked about the 2016 election. We talked about the Dallas shooting. So the whole social justice issue, we've been responding to over the last 6 years anyway, since I've been there. And as a result of that, we were able to pivot very quickly and create a lot of internal programming, which I will save for later in the program, in order to address the psychological impact of what was occurring this summer and what was occurring as a result of COVID, and what continues to occur. So we haven't stopped because these issues are prevalent. We're looking at another surge now. And again, we have to begin to ask, how do we serve communities that we know are going to be impacted greater than others?
Thanks, Danny. That's a really complex response that it sounds like.
I'm sorry. I'm living in a complex world these days.
And it's really impressive. Can you tell us about some of the things that you have learned? As you noted, obviously COVID's disproportionately affected communities of color. And as you noted, we're starting to see an uptick again in the cases. Can you talk a little bit about some of the strategies that you were just discussing that you've learned from over the course of I know it's such a short timeline, but even over the course of the last 8 months or so that you think will help your organization as we deal with this again? In many ways, I know it's continuing, but
So one of the things we learned, so, not only did COVID highlight, the frailties in our society, but it also did in our organization. So when things are cracked in a time like COVID, where there's such intensity, they sort of show themselves and they illuminate. And one of the things we realized is that we had employees who did not have access to computers, right? And our environmental service workers, our transporters, our orderlies, and therefore they were not getting the daily messages that's necessary during a crisis time like COVID or during the race crisis this summer to take care of themselves, take care of patients, take care of their families. So we began to think about how do we inform those employees? And so we set up a texting program. Now that may sound simple, but many did not have iPhones. They had flip phones. So how do you begin to, and many spoke, English was not their first language. So then we also had to translate the messages, and our employees speak 5 different languages. So we had to ensure that these messages were getting out in 5 different languages. And we had to do, in-person conversations about what's going on, how it's going on, how do you take care of yourself? Because information was coming rapidly several times a day, all day long, and they were missing out on a lot of the information. And so just internally, that was one of the ways we realized that we needed to do something different and build a permanent platform, which is part of the United Against Racism strategy, so that our employees who do not have access to computers in their regular jobs actually have a way of staying connected to the organization, so they feel like they belong to the organization and are truly part of the organization.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think, so many organizations are dealing with the shift to remote work, but 78,000 employees in a healthcare organization during the pandemic is definitely a whole other level. So thank you for sharing those details with us.
Thanks, Danny. So the next question is for Deborah. I didn't tell Deborah I was going to do this, but if you're at the holiday season and you're looking for a worthy charitable contribution, take a look at Brookview House. You're going to have a hard time finding a more, just a more worthy charitable organization in the city of Boston. And I'm very biased. We've represented and consider Deborah to be a friend. We've represented them for a very long time. So Deborah, that's not the question. That's just my unsolicited sales. I know you're happy I said it. I want to make clear that she didn't tell me to say it. So Deborah, the question really is just tell us a little bit about your role and Brookview House's role, but then also I think we wanted to get to how you see nonprofits playing a a role in this movement for racial equality in the city of Boston. I think you're a great person to speak to that.
Definitely. Brookview was founded 30 years ago. So I want to be clear about that. We've been around a long time. And we're a Black and Latina women-led organization. And we work for, since the beginning, justice, equity, and systemic change for low-income mothers, children, and youth. And what we know is our constituents represent what systemic racism looks like. They experience or are at risk of homelessness. They're unemployed or underemployed. Most make less than $24,000 a year. They attend schools that are deprived of resources. Like Danny said, the pandemic really highlighted the lack of technology that our families have access to. And that became a huge problem when you're on lockdown, when you have to attend school remotely, when your mom's first language is not English, when your mom has no technology skills. This is what systemic racism looks like. But also we live in neighborhoods that are intentionally deprived of healthy food, services, and resources that can help you access the things that make your life better. So if you already start at a deficit, it's really hard to catch up without a lot of support and a lot of extra access. So at Brookview, we develop affordable housing, and that's how I know Chris, he's represented us for a number of years. And in developing affordable housing, it's a nonprofit effort, but it's a contentious effort. You're always at odds with everybody because nobody wants to live in a neighborhood where people, even people who are low income, don't want to live in a neighborhood where formerly homeless people or people who are homeless are coming to live. It's just, why do we vote against our best interests? You know, the election showed us people vote against their own best interests all the time. So people are opposed to developing affordable housing, but that's what we do, and we're intentional about it. And it's for people who are homeless, people at risk of homelessness. We're intentional about saying that. And our role is to address the root causes that are inherent in the American system. And how we do that is we advocate for change to the system, and we help our constituents find their voices. So it's not just about Brookview advocating, it's about helping our constituents become advocates for change. And that's the most important role. And I think that's the role for nonprofits in general. Their role is the same. They need to advocate for systemic change because nonprofits do a very poor job of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
Very poor job. And there's a question coming up later, and I'll talk about that a bit more.
Sorry, I was muted for a second there. Thanks, Deborah. So Ingrid, my next question is for you. You know, as we've heard here today, obviously there's so many different factors that go into this inequity: healthcare, housing, the nonprofit world. What role do you see the financial services industry playing in dismantling economic inequality?
No softball questions here. I would say it's a daunting, large problem, and I think it's so multifaceted that sometimes it could be incredibly overwhelming. So I don't want to even be slightly delusional or naive when I say that. There's a wealth gap. You know, the Boston Globe has written articles on the wealth gap between, you know, Caucasian families and Black families. It's tremendous. There's a gender wealth gap. There are women that are potentially going to be stepping out of the workforce simply because of the burdens of, even for those people that are blessed enough to be able to work from home. Women are traditionally filled a caregiver role. When there's a two-parent household, they tend to be the ones that have to lean into that. Or if there's a single-parent household, they are taking a lot of that burden. So there's so many things that are happening that are a part of that story that's the backdrop. So as you think about all of those things, and I'm sure a million other factoids that I could probably throw out there, we're trying to figure out from an industry, what can we do to help that? Some of that comes from smaller things like provided scholarships, maybe working through organizations like UNCF to United Negro College Fund in order to help support talent coming through the pipeline, and supporting organizations like Posse and whatnot. And so having that direct connection to firms or nonprofits that are supporting the growth and development of youth to come through the pipeline to be potential candidates in the future. There's also things around simple things like if you're a bank and you are in a predominantly, Spanish speaking neighborhood, that you hire tellers that speak Spanish. I mean, it's just, there's certain things that are basic and there's certain things that are across the whole system that they're going to take a lot of great minds in order to figure out how to dismantle. And so it is difficult on a good day, this close to, I won't say impossible, but very much something that the way that Danny talked a few moments ago about how you have to attack something from like so many different angles, I would certainly say the same as for the finance industry. So it is understanding how loans are made, understanding how credit is attributed to individuals. And when I say understanding, meaning taking a look at that and examining, are we finding that we are disproportionately leaning towards one demographic versus another, and if so, why, and if so, what can we do to make a change in that space? It is all manners of, are people underinsured, I think a few moments ago Deborah was talking about just neighborhoods. Are banks in the right neighborhoods? Are they educating and providing financial literacy? Are there nonprofits that can help support to build the acumen of people so that they understand why saving is so important? There's so many different elements to that are so huge. I know that the city, if I'm not mistaken, Kaylin, feel free to correct me, but I'm pretty sure that Mayor Walsh put some things in place to say, hey, what are we doing to help women learn how to negotiate? There's so many different factors. A female having a stronger financial acumen or financial footing is better positioned to help support the family to grow, to kind of manifest a virtuous circle. So there's so many elements that touch in not from a traditional, like, what can the finance industry do? Cross your arms and wait for 3 bullet items that you can go execute and check the box off. It is because it is so insidious and intertwined and so difficult to untangle, is why there's so many times where companies and individuals and nonprofits kind of do this start. We got some progress, but wait, that person left to take another position, so now we have to start all over again. There's so many different underpinnings. I'm trying to be positive. I think it's still doable. It's just a matter of there's many things that add to the complexity. So I'll let others weigh in on things for their industries.
Thanks, Ingrid.
Thanks, Ingrid. So, and that's a great segue back to Carolyn. So Carolyn, it's kind of the same question. It's what role do you think the city or government as a whole, state or even federal government as a role plays in bringing different sectors together, obviously focused on Boston, bringing sectors together to foster a greater equality in the community, both business, government, healthcare, all these things. And I know there's a lot of excitement about your role in bringing those sectors together.
Yeah, we are in a huge moment, all of us, to try to think about what our institutions need to be to make it through this moment of upheaval, of crisis, of near catastrophe that we're all fighting through. So before I mentioned the fact that we were in this sort of triple pandemic, obviously the racial reckoning that we're in, the COVID pandemic, and also this moment of economic slowdown and even shutdown for folks. And so because of all of these conditions, we are being forced to ask ourselves very clearly and very deliberately, what kind of institutions are we remaking and rebuilding in this moment to make sure that so many of the communities that we've discussed, that Danny certainly mentioned, communities of color, Black and brown populations who have been disproportionately affected by all of these catastrophes. How are we ensuring to ourselves that we are actually living into a bigger, bolder vision that is much more centered on equity? Government absolutely has to play a role there. I mean, I sit here in City Hall today, knowing that we represent the 700,000 people that live in the city of Boston. It is absolutely my charge to make sure that these communities on all the populations of our city, their interests, their needs, and their demands are not only represented and spoken to, but are addressed. And so government has an incredibly important role to play in calling out our needs, our values, refining our values, and calling out when we get it wrong. Boston City Hall has not always gotten this thing right. That is clear and that is true. When we talk about racism as I mentioned, a toxin, as a public health crisis and as an emergency, it's calling out the fact that we have made a decision as a society to organize ourselves based on racial hierarchy, that there somehow is this belief, this agreement that organizing people based on race and ethnicity and this cascading hierarchy is okay, and we know it's not. So how can we, if we know that's the case, how can we demonstrate our seriousness? For government, that means calling that out and calling everyone else into account with us and holding us accountable. So as I think through what generational change looks like, which I'm also charged to do, to think about change, not just right now, today in 2020 or even in 2021. But I ask myself, what does it mean to truly imagine generational change? I do feel like in so many respects, based on the unprecedented nature of the moment that we're in, we are being asked to, again, remake so many institutions and entities in the public sector, in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector. Deborah, I appreciated so much your calling out of the sector, saying all of us have our blemishes, our warts, and all of us can say many of the ways that our institutions and our sectors have all contributed to the moment that we are in. And I think Kathleen's earlier question about folks who are outside, folks who are in the streets, some of the rallying that we've seen makes me really thoughtful about the Black Lives Matter movement, and to know that there are young people who are still in the street who are saying that there's got to be a very different way of thinking about systems change and how our institutions function. And listening to what people are saying to us and what they are not only saying, but demanding is absolutely the path to thinking about this question of generational change. It has to be a transformation now. If we find ourselves, God forbid, in the midst of another pandemic in a year or 2 or 5, or on the other side of this promising breakthrough with vaccines, we find ourselves in yet another pandemic. What will we have learned from all the crises that we're in now? What will we have learned about the racial reckoning? What will we have learned about our public health needs? What will we have learned about health equity, economic equity? If we have learned nothing, we will find ourselves in this very same position again in 10 years and in a generation, and shame on us if we find ourselves there. So government absolutely has to ring the bell as loud as possible over and over again. And I'm just grateful to know that I'm on this call and in this room with like-minded soldiers and willing workers, because there is so much work to do, but we have to do it now, and we have to commit, and we have to refuse to be small. Absolutely refuse to be small, even as precarious as this moment is. And that to me is what gives me so much sense of determination and focus in terms of making real and making concrete what are the promises and what are the pledges and the commitments that we can make right now.
Thank you, Carolyn. I think obviously such a powerful point that you're making. And one thing that it comes to mind when we're talking about what are we going to see, what are we going to have learned when we're on the other side of this pandemic. Danny, I know that you wrote an op-ed for the BBJ over the spring, warning that if businesses are not careful, we're going to come out. I mean, obviously, we've learned that this pandemic has disproportionately affected communities of color, and it's, as everybody here has said, widened gaps and exacerbated problems that have already existed. But one thing that you pointed out is there's a danger that businesses who've invested in diversity and inclusion and equity are, might cut those back during this pandemic. Everybody's feeling an economic squeeze, and maybe some of those programs, despite the importance and despite the cultural moment that we're having, maybe some of those programs are being cut back. And you wrote in your op-ed, I think, Danny, that, not only is this the right time to focus on diversity and inclusion because it's the right thing to do, but also it's a smart business move. And so I want to ask Danny and Ingrid, as the Chief Diversity Officers that we have here with us today. As Ingrid said, I know there's no checklist. And as Carolyn said, I don't want us to think small, but are there specific strategies that you have found that other organizations can maybe investigate, implement, that can help come out on so that they come out on the other side, better positioned for success through diversity and inclusion? I know, Danny, you talked a lot about the initiatives that Mass General Brigham, but maybe you two can give us some more insights on some of the strategies that your organizations have found to be useful.
You want to go, Ingrid?
Ingrid?
So I would say, I'm a trained organization development person. So I look at things from a change process and use that methodology. And in that, I like to understand what's the environment I'm working in. So evidence-based interventions are significant and important because you don't know what you're trying to fix until you understand what the issue is. And so analytics and these types of interventions are critical, meaning what does your organization look like from a different demographic perspective? How does talent flow through your organization? Who are you servicing if you're customer base organization? And based on that data and others, do people feel engaged at work? Don't they feel engaged at work? Are they having the same experience by racial groups, gender groups, LGBT groups, et cetera? And then you can begin to say, okay, this is what we know is fact versus what we think is going on. Because sometimes perception is not accurate, as we all know, right? And so once one understands what's going on, then you begin to think about what are ways in which we can shift that. So, to dismantle structural racism, sometimes you often have to create new structures, and organizations are often hesitant to do that. So a new structure for us is like creating hiring goals that hold our leaders accountable, and it's tied to their compensation, right? That makes a difference. I've seen it around the globe make a difference because then people begin to react differently to this. And not only with systems, I find the hardest part of this work, quite honestly, is behavior change. We can do the policies, we can write the systems, we can create the structures, but until leaders, and I say leaders because people mimic their leaders, behave differently, it doesn't change. So, some of my clients used to say, oh, Danny, they'd get so excited. We had a 25% diverse candidate pool. I said, that's great. So what about your finalists? Oh, well, and I said, well, did you hire somebody? Because that's where it makes the difference, is your diverse panel pool. Yeah, that's the first step, but did you pull the trigger and hire someone? And so when people ask me what can they do and they're in a leadership position, I said it's simple. When you have an opening, hire a diverse person. It's not complicated, right? It is just not complicated. Some of this, but what's complex for that individual is their own internal attitudes around people who are different than them and what they truly believe about Black people and brown people at the core. And it is set in codes. Well, Danny, that person was great, but they didn't quite fit. Well, fit can mean a lot of things in an organization, right? And in an environment. And so it's all of those things that begin to make a difference in this work. There's not one thing, but what I have seen is when a CEO stands up and says, we're not going to do this any longer, and this is what we're going to do, and he or she behaves in that way, and they hold their direct reports accountable in that way, all of a sudden things change. And it can be that simple. As complex as the problem is, it can be that simple. But there's a lot of resistance to those changes because there's a lot of embedded in maintaining the status quo at the same time while folks are talking about how horrible the race crisis was this summer. You know, at an unconscious level, there is that dichotomy and that tension that exists in people's minds. And so when, you know, Carolyn was asking, what are we going to look like and what are we going to be 10 years from now? That's really pushing on people's psychological comfort around this work, their lives in terms of how they view their lives, who's going to get promoted, what neighborhoods are going to be like. It is all of those pieces that make this difficult work, but it really, as much as we're talking about structural racism, that gets supported by people's behaviors.
And Dan, if I could just jump in because that point,
yeah, go ahead.
Wow. You know, this point you make is so powerful about behavior as well, because you're talking about the culture. So
Yeah.
we're talking about culture change inside
Yeah.
of organizations, and just wanted to underscore the point because I teach public policy, I write policy, and we know that culture eats policy for lunch all day.
All the time.
So unless we really kind of lean into this point that has been made, we're missing something. And it just kind of has to do with the comfort level of organizations willing to be uncomfortable with decision-making modes and how we actualize those. So just really just appreciating you more than anything for making this point, because it too often does not get made. It is kind of the gold and the heart of so many of these issues. So just a thank you.
You know, you're
Yeah, I would.
Ingrid?
No, I was going to add, I was laughing mentally as you were talking, because I was like, yep, said that 2 weeks ago. Yep. It's like she and I are in so many alignment spaces, and I guess obviously doing the same job, that makes total sense. The data, you brought that up first and foremost, and I totally agree with you. Without that, without the examination of like how people are moving through the system as you described it, and for many people that work at their firms, so I am only guessing as to who may be in the audience here, but there's a lot of folks who just kind of are floating through the system, meaning they're hired, they're doing their day job, you know, they're making widgets, whatever that is, which is great. We need people to be doing that. However, they're not necessarily thinking in a very close examination about what and how people get promoted, what process that is. Like, is there a succession planning, or is there a formal sponsorship, or people being mentored? There's so many little small pieces that can help move people along in the promotion and whatnot.
Yeah.
The only reason I bring that up is because when Danny said, even though it's an amazingly complex problem, the solution is quite simple. It's startlingly simple. It just depends on the level of energy and urgency that you have around it. So I'll just give an example for those that are on the call going, yeah, she can say that, she's a CDO. When you think about, let's say, March 5th, if you were to walk in and knock on the door of any CEO or CHRO and say, I'd like to have 100% adoption of work from home, go. They would laugh you out and actually maybe even call security, because somehow something had happened to you, you'd fallen and hit in your head for you to think that you could go from probably 3 to 7% adoption rate of people working remotely in your companies to 100%. And lo and behold, an amazing event happened, tragic one, but it still happened. And when it did, we went from 0 virtually to 100% adoption of something that so many people would have told you that's absolutely impossible. And it happened. So when Danny says it's amazingly simple, it is. It's a matter of figuring out whatever that forcing action is. And for us, it was the sad, awareness that COVID hit and we had to do something. It made it a reality instantaneously. Within that second or third week of March, the entire world was learning what Zoom was. You know, That's what I guess we're trying to say, is that it is within all of our power to make the changes we want to see, definitely within our lifetime,
Yeah.
definitely within a day if we decide to make those kinds of decisions. But it is a matter of understanding the weight and the gravitas of how urgent we want to drive and actually make actions happen
Yeah.
versus, for lack of a better word, navel gazing and contemplating. Obviously, some of the stuff we've got to examine systems, but even me saying these things makes people very uncomfortable. And I recognize that, because in their brains, they made or come to the understanding, but wait, how can that be? Because it's going to take forever to do all that examination. What about all the complexity she talked about earlier? Yes, that all is still there.
Yeah.
But
And
as I
so
just
that-
said before, when we made and pulled the trigger to say we were going to work from home, suddenly everybody got computers at home. We got Zoom, like all those things happened. We figured it out, and we didn't have it perfect, but it
Mhm.
somehow came to be. So Danny, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, and we can't wait on perfection, right? And what I've marveled at during this time, to that point of behavior change, we stood up a field hospital in a week with 1,000 beds in it. Now, there was no one in our organization, and not just we did it with the city and the government and a whole bunch of other, Boston Medical. We all, when you talk about what we learned in this, we learned to collaborate with each other because our lives depended on it. And there was no one in our organization who knew how to stand up a field hospital, but they figured it out in a week's time. And that hospital was serving a large Latino population because they couldn't get healthcare in other places. So that was being used for those circumstances. So during the COVID pandemic, we were doing things at our system that would never have been done before in terms of collaborating across the system and making things happen. And I said to one of my colleagues recently, and they were talking about some project and it was going to take like a year. I said, can't we use some of that COVID ingenuity, and get it done in 3 months? I said, we know how to do this, right? We know how to move faster. And so let's use some of that, because to Carolyn's point, that's what it's going to take to have it different 10 years from now.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. I do want to circle back to Deborah. Sort of next question we had was really coming off of your BBJ op-ed, where you noticed and you wrote about how in the last 15 years, the number or percentage of people of color leading nonprofits on the boards of nonprofits has not increased in the face of a changing sort of demographic in the city of Boston. It was a bit of a call to action. I'd say it was a call to action, not a bit of one. And so I thought you could hit on that and what you sort of your views and opinions on how organizations, nonprofits in particular, increase their diversity and make improvements in that front.
To put nonprofits in perspective, I think we have to understand how they sort of radiate out to for-profits, nonprofits, and every other sector in the country. They serve every age, every gender, every race, every socioeconomic status. It's about museums, it's about families, it's about hunger, it's about disasters, it's about shelter, it's about education. So nonprofits are huge. And they started doing these studies about the leadership of nonprofits in about 2005. And what they showed is 80% of the leadership in nonprofit organizations across this country are white, 80%. And they've done follow-up studies since 2005. They did one in 2011. They did one in 2018. They did one in 2019. They did them locally in Massachusetts. So it's been studied. It's about data. It's not about hypotheticals. It's not about what we think. It's a fact. It hasn't changed in 15 years, despite the fact that we have the data. And nonprofits generate billions of dollars in revenue for both the nonprofit sector as well as the for-profit sector. Because we buy insurance, we pay taxes, we pay, You know, we have folks who pay payroll taxes. We have people who own homes, people who, so nonprofits affect all of us, but they haven't changed. And in light of having the data, we know they're refusing to change. And I'm going to be honest, they have to do the work in order to make the change. It ain't easy. I'll be the first one to tell you, it ain't easy, but you got to be committed to do the work. And it starts with each of us who are in leadership. You know, Ingrid and Danny just talked about how folks mimic their leadership. If the leadership doesn't do anything, then what's your incentive to change?
Yeah.
You know, we do what our leaders do. We want to be like them. You know, we want to be like Mike. We want to be in charge of things. We want to elevate ourselves into those positions. But if that position is homogeneous, then I would never be able to see myself in that role or in that position. You know, I always talk about being, I'm a woman, and I've always gone to, you know, girls' schools, women's colleges, always been in the women's field. So when I came into the nonprofit arena, my goal was to elevate women to leadership positions, because I knew, and I always saw women in leadership positions.
Yeah.
So I knew they could do it. I knew women of color could do it. So that's my hidden agenda. Now my verbal outward agenda is to make it happen. So it starts with self, and it requires more than a statement, because in 2019 they, you know, did a little follow-up piece showing that 52% of nonprofits have a statement about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but only 30% have a strategy.
Right.
And you can't get to it without a strategy. You can't
Yeah.
solve the problem without a strategy.
Yeah.
What it says is you just thought about it. You know, I went to a recent, I participated in a webinar recently. See, I'm still in 2019. I'm going places. Yeah, I participated in a webinar, and one of the things they were advising nonprofits to do is make your public-facing statement about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not about a statement, it's about action. And we have to take action. We do.
I just like to, so Deborah was talking about women in leadership, and we'd be remiss if we didn't bring up, you know, Kamala Harris and becoming the VP, you know. And what I'm finding interesting in observing, and this is a question to my colleagues, more and more she's being announced as the first woman VP, and Black is being left out of the announcement. My observation, it could be my own filter system going on, but I have been noticing that, and statistics say that you notice race before you notice gender. And so I'm wondering if it's a slow, like more acceptable if we notice her gender than we do her race. Or does one have to be called out or not? Because I think this is the way the culture of racism evolves in our country and plays out. So it's just something I've been thinking about, and have asked some colleagues to start paying attention to see what they notice around it, because as Deborah was talking about leadership and who we see with it, and who's there. But I was like, this is interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
I noticed it.
Did you notice it? Yeah, Ingrid. And it's great that it's, you know, her gender is being recognized, but there's also a big piece about, you know, who she is as a woman of color, and the impact of that, and the historical piece of that. But are we making it more palatable to folks to just say woman?
I can't help but think of the Combahee River Collective and our foremothers who put forward our understanding of intersectionality.
Yeah.
So when I think of Audre Lorde,
Mm.
and I think of Charlene McCray, and I think of Beverly Smith and all the work that they did right here in Boston, actually, in the 70s, to lift up the Combahee Statement, which tells us that the way that we experience power's oppression or expansion through our identities cannot be separated. So we think about race and gender and our ability, our sexual identity, our sexual preferences, all of this is being acted on by these structures. And so, you know, Dana, your observation is interesting in the way that the media and or other people talk about identities of people who are in position.
Yeah.
And for me, it brings us back to this foundational understanding of power, and how that is what we're really talking about here. And it does get frustrating in this field and in this moment when we're talking about equity, or we're talking about diversity or inclusion or multiculturalism, or whether it was Africana studies beforehand or the movement and all these things. These words change, but from this kind of break point of the institutionalization of slavery and the move toward emancipation since then, which continues, this question about power. Who has it? What does it mean in terms of your life? Your day-to-day survival is key. And I think the point that was made earlier, that what this moment that we're in has done for us, I think, Dana, you made this point when you were talking about the powerful move to stand up a hospital, this field hospital. The city was a part of this conversation in 5 or 6 days. What we learned is that our fates were tied.
Right.
It was life and death. That is always true, except there are moments when we realize that, or moments where that really shakes us out of sleep. And so this question or this issue around power, how do we really call out the nakedness of power to kill and to oppress, is this thing that we can kind of make it seem nice because we're talking about statements and offices and policies.
Right.
But the nakedness of this struggle and the need to, again, be bold into thinking about what the political economy of suffering is costing us is what we're being called to consider in this moment. And so I think all of us have made comments today about what it means to dare to be super uncomfortable for as long as we can to kind of make this thing right, is really kind of the spirit of some of what I hope we can leave you with. So I hope that what you heard, at least from me a little bit, was maybe interesting. I don't know. These other women said some very powerful things, but the desire to be very uncomfortable even when this call is over, and to stand in that and to figure out, well, how do you make that right in your institutions? How do you make that right in your company, in your city, is what we must do, because I think that it's not easy, and it can't be. And if it feels like it's easy, then we're addressing the wrong thing.
Right. Exactly.
Amen. That's all I have to say.
Absolutely. Carolyn, I think you really wrapped it up for us there. I mean, this is a conversation that could continue forever, but I think, thank you for that closing. Thank you, all of you, for participating in this panel. You've given us so much to think about. And we have so much to do. And so I think, we'll all be inspired by everything that you've shared with us today. And again, we really can't thank you enough for participating. We're really grateful for your insights. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It's been great.
Yeah.
So much.
Great getting to know people who I
Yes.
don't know already. Yeah.
And
Awesome.
tag us in LinkedIn if you have further questions. I'm sure I want to give people that opportunity to reach out, because I know sometimes we make it sound much easier than it actually is, or much harder than it actually is. So I think it'd be great. Feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you, Ingrid. We appreciate that. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.